Hello friends, welcome to another day of Q&As, joined by my lovely and helpful wife Lucie.
Hi guys.
If you want a question answered here, post it on my Ask Leo post on Instagram. Let's do our question for today.
Alright, next question is by Ryan Act 22. Is it immoral for addicts in recovery to have children if their addiction spans many generations?
Thank you, Lucie. So, this is a rather specific question. So I usually try not to answer specific questions on the Ask Leo series. But the reason why I want to answer this is because this touched my heart, and clearly the person is thinking quite deeply about it. So this video is not going to get many views, I'm sure, but hopefully we'll talk about some things that are useful for people to understand. The first thing is, addiction is both learned behavior and someone can be predisposed to addiction genetically. Learned behavior aside, let's talk about the genetic predisposition. I know he said he's an addict in recovery, which means he's an addict that's no longer using substance abuse. I really don't like this term recovery because it makes the person sound like they're, I don't know how to describe it. It's like, imagine you broke your leg, but you're in a cast for the rest of your life. It's not the correct, I feel like maybe it's helpful for some people, but it debilitates other people. It makes them feel like they're not a whole human being, and they are. They are whole human beings, and they can become whole again, and that's how this is a big disagreement actually in the alcoholic or addict literature, where they talk about whether addiction is a disease that you can't get rid of. The great book on this is called US of AA. I've mentioned it before, but the Alcoholics Anonymous organization is what propagated this term that alcoholism or drug addiction is a disease and you can't get rid of it. Anyway, the point is, leaving aside the behavioral element, even though he's in recovery, let's talk about the genetic element briefly. Now, I haven't prepared anything for this discussion because I just thought to talk off the top of my head. But there are genes, many genes, that are significantly associated with addiction and in the brain. And they're not just, like for example, one of them is in the ghrelin receptor. Ghrelin is the hunger hormone. What does that have to do with addiction? Well, the ghrelin receptor polymorphisms that make some people more likely to eat more and get more hungry also make other people more likely to drink beer and drink more when they do drink. There are many polymorphisms. So they could be at the norepinephrine receptor, they could be at the dopamine, they are at the dopamine receptors, they are at the serotonin receptors. Serotonin, I'll talk about this in another video one day, but serotonin, so several of the serotonin receptors, agonism at that receptor reduces the desire someone wants to have to do an addictive behavior.
Okay.
Now, it's not clear how this works exactly, but so basically, if you give someone a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, this is a bit off topic, but if you give someone a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, they're less likely to want cocaine after. So anyways, so some genes that serotonin affect addiction, some genes that dopamine receptors, norepinephrine receptors, GABA receptors are very involved with addiction. Because GABA is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter system in the body. People who have less GABAergic signaling are more on edge. Therefore, more likely a lot of the time to want to be outside themselves. Addicts will use this term, I want to feel other than myself, right? So the GABA ones, glutamate, I think there are some glutamate SNPs that are associated with addiction. What I'm trying to say here is not run a list of neurotransmitters. What I'm trying to say is there are addictive SNPs at every single neurotransmitter's structure and genetically. So there are so many ways addiction could be more likely depending on your genetic predispositions. I have never seen a person's cognitive enhancement genetic analysis that I do that didn't have 5 or 10 SNPs associated with addiction. Now, some have way more than others. That's no question about that. But, so number one, everybody has those genes. Second of all, are those genes bad or good? It depends. It really depends. I've mentioned this before to clients and maybe in videos also, but people who are born in families that have a schizophrenic tend to be more artistic. This has been noted for hundreds of years, a long time ago. Bipolar disorder, same thing. People in families that have somebody with pathological bipolar disorder, which means the person cannot function, right? A lot of people use the term, I was arguing about this with someone on the phone the other day. He was telling me that bipolar, I hope he sees this video. He was telling me that bipolar, I know this person's bipolar, this person is in his family. I said, they're not bipolar. bipolar means they cannot function. You cannot sit in the same room as them. What you mean is that they are slightly manic depressive. It's not that pathological. It's like sometimes, anyway, the point is, in a bipolar scenario, family members tend to be more hardworking and more ambitious. What I'm trying to say is, the reason why these genes exist, why they were not bred out in hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution, is because when they're not pathological, they give us an advantage. These mutations. See, a mutation, genes mutate very infrequently. When they mutate, usually they cause a debilitating illness and death. But sometimes those mutations don't cause that. Then what happens? These mutations become more common in the human genetic pool, and they become called variants.
Mm-hmm.
So you have an ancestral variant, and then you have a new variant, which is a mutation. So these mutations won't exist long term unless they provide some kind of advantage. Maybe when you are homozygous, meaning you have two alleles of the same nature and the same single nucleotide polymorphism, it may be bad for you. But maybe if you have one, it's not bad. Or maybe if you have one in combination with another set of genes, it's not bad. What I'm trying to say here is, think of it this way. The same things that drive addiction drive ambition. If the person doesn't get towards substances, if you keep the person away from substances, they have a greater need to satisfy themselves than other people. Someone with a high GABAergic signaling, high serotonergic signaling, who is relaxed all the time and chilling, maybe they don't want to do drugs. They're happy, but they also don't want to go sacrifice so much for their ambition, for their career. They don't want to go work 15 hours a day. They don't want to do all of that because they don't have something to satisfy inside themselves, where they're not happy with themselves. So what I'm saying is, the same genes that you may think debilitated you may empower your child to be what people call great, right? So that's the first thing. And the second thing is about the environment. So there are people that grow up in households with addict parents, two addict parents, and never use drugs. They are. I've met many. I really have a lot of experience with it. I've seen this. The people will grow up with parents that both have addiction issues, but they see that the parents had this. They see it destroyed their lives, and from a young age they promise themselves, I will never drink, I will never do this, I will never do that. Many people have done that in history. In fact, some are like great people. I can't recall right now, but some business tycoons grew up just like that. They saw their parents were alcoholics, this was older times, and they decided never to touch alcohol, period. And so that can happen even if you're not an addict in recovery. Your child can grow up and say, what you're doing is not right. I love you, but what you're doing is not right, and I can't do it. Now, maybe you'll also influence your child to become an addict, of course. But if you're in recovery, that's not an issue right now. So what I'm trying to say is, don't be concerned that there's something wrong with you. There's only something wrong with you if you use hedonistic substances that cause a release of dopamine, right? And that thing that's wrong with you, supposedly, could be your advantage if you don't touch that substance. Think of it like the substance you're using is like kryptonite, and you are Superman. But if you encounter kryptonite, you're completely weakened. But if you don't encounter it, you have more drive, you have more tenacity. The same thing that makes you addicted to substances will also make you addicted to anything that gives you dopamine release, which means it could be, if you know how to schedule it the right way in your lifestyle, it could be reading a book. You could make it such that reading a book makes you happy, and you will be more determined and more tenacious in that work than someone without those addictive genes. So do you see what I mean? So don't look at it as a weakness within yourself. That's all I wanted to say really regarding that. And don't take it as a for granted that even if you weren't in recovery, your children would grow up to become addicts.
No, it's also about education and the way you present them things.
And he also mentioned, or he or she also mentioned, this intergenerational addiction thing. This may not also just be genetic. Keep in mind, the genes really get diluted each time. What's really happening there is probably learning.
Yeah, and the environment.
And the environment. And this happens, there are intergenerational criminal families. Mm-hmm. Like for 4, 5, or 6 generations, they're what are called deadbeats and whatever. There are many families like that, and there are families that intergenerationally, like the Rothschilds, or there are fewer of these. But no, I think of all the aristocratic houses in Europe. Some of them, these guys have conquered, not conquered, but they ended up like the German princes. They ended up ruling almost all of Europe. There are intergenerational, they learn things, they transmit them to each other. They're not just genetic. But anyway, my point is, it's not a done discussion. And the fact that you have genes that predispose you to addiction don't mean that you are handicapped. They may mean that you are either handicapped or advantaged, depending on the environment.
Yeah, and I think that him asking himself these questions about having children and taking
shows responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
That's why I admired this, and I wanted to answer the question. Really, don't think of yourself as weaker than others. Trust me, something. Nobody goes, every great person you know in history had some kind of addictive element in their life. Mm-hmm. They have to, even, because you have to get a dopamine release from something and be tenacious at staying at that thing to conquer, to succeed with anything great. Like even, scientific people, von Neumann, Einstein, all these people were somewhat what you would call habituated or addicted to their work. They were, like von Neumann was famous for being so absent. He's the creator of game theory. He was so absent-minded that, people thought he was a funny guy. He was like, they would call him autistic now or whatever. But he was stuck on his work. Mm. And the same exists for all the great scientists, all the great conquerors of history. Many people like that, is that they had a kind of determination, and that has elements of in it of addiction, but not pathological. You know what I mean? So it's up to you whether your addiction becomes pathological or not. Hope this helped, and keep your hopes up, and you're thinking the right way. I really think so. All right, see you later.